But let's talk about this versus the 2016 version, because the 2016 version,
Oh man.
I would argue, is an unmitigated train wreck. And I will say, like, this in comparison to that is just night and day for me. Like, there is an actual story here. They don't like there are funny moments that are organically funny. They're written to be funny. They're not just, four SNL cast members just like improving for literally. I watched a thing with Paul Feig, and he said that they do 5-hour takes where they let the cameras roll for like 5 hours, and they just let these girls just like improv away until, and Hemsworth and everybody else. Like, you're just like, you've got Melissa McCarthy and Kate McKinnon and Leslie Jones. And it's just like, 5 hours, really? And that, like, first of all, that's the best you got out of 5 hours. But secondly, you can't cut together a coherent story from that. Because who knows what tangent they're on when the funniest thing happens in that 5-hour session is something that has no connection to anything else. All you're doing from that point as an editor is trying to desperately find some way to connect it back to the previous scene. And there's like no way to do it. And then, Dan Aykroyd even said in one of his interviews that they did like $40 million worth of reshoots on that movie, which of course they did, because they got like disconnected scenes that they had to like figure out how to like, go from one to another. Like, there's just terrible way to make a movie.
So, I went and saw 2016 Ghostbusters in the theater with some friends.
I feel bad for you.
Yeah, that's what I did. That was a choice that I made. Mistakes were made. But, like, I don't remember a single line from that movie.
No.
I don't remember the plot. Like, the only thing I can really remember is that Chris Hemsworth was a ditz. And that's it.
And he was like the funniest part of that movie. By the way, he was basically the best part of that movie was Hemsworth.
Yeah, but they did him so dirty.
Oh yeah,
like
no. Well, there's so many things about that movie that just failed on so many levels, and one of them for me is like I believe so. Part of the reason that one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this piece of it was because Ghostbusters Afterlife, I think, does a really, really good job of treating the source material with a lot of reverence, probably too much reverence, creating an opportunity for a decent handoff between, Bill Murray and Ernie Hudson and Dan Aykroyd to the kids, to the new generation. It also introduces a whole bunch of new characters, and they are, by any measure, like really diverse in the way that we talk about diversity and representation in films. And yet, this is why I went to Nerdrotic and Critical Drinker and guys like that to look at their reviews, because I kind of wanted to know if they had anything to say about the fact that you had two female Ghostbusters, one of whom is black, one of whom is autistic, so like neuroatypical. You've got a Korean kid, and then like the white kid, boy. In Finn Lockhart's character. So you've got like a really diverse mix of what are now going to be the modern era of Ghostbusters. We assume we're going to be sort of the modern era of Ghostbusters. Nobody said a word about it. Everybody said that gosh, I lost track of her name already. I apologize. McKenna Grace was great. Everybody had positive things to say about all the kids, generally, except for Finn Lockhart, actually. And I think that's mostly because I just feel like he just doesn't have a lot to do. Like, he's not really that important to the story in general. But
yeah, that was a writing issue, not an acting issue.
No, he would have been fine if he had a little bit more going on. And I feel a little bit the same way about Lucky, the other girl. They were kind of going for, like, he was trying to have her be his girlfriend and whatnot. And it was one of these things from the first act that I just feel like you should have trimmed down. Like you could have found a better way to do a lot of that. But in any case, you have a very diverse cast, and everybody seems to be pretty happy with all of those choices. Like, certainly the choices for actors and like the core idea of having these kids come together and all that seemed to work pretty well. And none of these guys who got blasted by Paul Feig and Sony and everybody else and were called misogynists and whatever else have had anything negative to say about, you know, McKenna Grace, for example, who you could, you know, if that was your motive, right? Like, you would have just as much a problem with this movie as you would have with 2016, except for 2016, it didn't do any of the same. It didn't have any of the same problems that 2016 had. It didn't. First of all, it didn't make a politically topical villain, because the villain in 2016 was a misogynist, like, basement dwelling internet troll, basically. Like, that was the villain. That was the bad guy of that movie. Like, it was meant to poke fun.
I didn't remember that.
Yeah, he was, because it doesn't matter. Because it was completely forgettable and awful and just badly handled and everything else. But I just thought it was interesting that, like, all of the same critiques, if they were true about the critics of the Ghostbusters 2016, should have applied to this movie. But you don't see the same reaction. You see a very different reaction from those guys. So, I don't know. I think that's pretty telling to me that, like, there's a lot of what Paul Feig and what Sony was doing with 2016 was more coping and trying to, like, find a reason why their trailer that looked and just was awful, like, why it was getting reviewed so poorly, why it was getting so many dislikes, you know, because widely, you know, one of the most disliked YouTube videos of all time, right? But I think the actual answer is much more straightforward. The answer is it was terrible, you know. Like, and the movie was terrible. So there you go.
Yeah, and that is kind of the climate we found ourselves in here lately, is that, like, the moment you begin criticizing a piece of content, people assume the absolute worst about your reasoning for it. Which is weird. Like, oh, you just didn't like the casting because you don't like women, or you don't like black people, or you just want it all to be stories about straight white cis men, you hater. I'm like, well, no, that's not really what my jam is, but I do want good content. But nobody lets other people make that argument anymore. Like, there's so much pushback and just assumptions about why you're criticizing a thing, instead of, like, from, like, a philosophical point of view, instead of examining, well, maybe this piece of content does have issues. Like, that is not the default assumption anymore. And it makes me very, very sad, because it makes it very, very difficult to have conversations with other people.
Well, they're bad faith.
Should be getting, it's all in bad faith. Like, I run into this in, like, the Facebook groups that I'm in. Mm-hmm. Like, I can't say anything about anything because someone's going to pick a fight with me, assuming things that are not in evidence. And it's infuriating.
Yeah. People bring an awful, and I think this is true across our society in general right now. Like, people bring a lot of their own baggage into every discussion they have. And so there's just all of these assumptions that, like, well, you didn't like this because you're this label, right? Like, because I've determined that you're this person, and therefore I can't conceive of any reason that you would possibly disagree with me other than you've got this identity that I dislike or whatever. And it's just like, or you could, like, we could just talk about it point by point, and we could talk about whether or not I'm right that, like, for example, Ghostbusters 2016 was a disjointed mess that really didn't connect and didn't have a clear story. Or that, like, you know, one of the things I went back to, like, I accidentally, just because it autoplayed, ended up watching a chunk of the Plinkett review of Ghostbusters 2016, which is also worth watching, by the way. And he talks a lot, like, throughout that whole review, like, Mike Stoklasa's whole point in all of that is that, like, they step on their own jokes constantly. Like, instead of letting the scenes breathe, because it's all improv based, it's like immediately Melissa McCarthy is like talking over a moment that needs space. And so like there are all these good ideas for jokes. Like one of the examples that stuck out to me was like they're sort of doing that scene where they're testing the equipment for the first time, and she fires the little proton stream from the proton pack, and it's kind of like pew, and it's like a weak stream basically. And so it's a little bit of like it's like a little bit of a risque weak stream joke, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a fine joke. It's a funny idea conceptually. But instead of just allowing it to be like a weak womp womp, like the weak stream happens and it's like, oh, okay, that didn't reach the ghost she was trying to get to, and it's a funny image and it calls, all these other things. Immediately, Melissa McCarthy starts quipping, oh, weak stream, that really didn't... It's like, just stop. Just stop. Like, let it go. Let it breathe. It's okay for a joke to breathe. And then the counterexample he gave was where in the first Ghostbusters movie, in the original Ghostbusters, they're in the hotel, the hotel, and they're in the hallway, and like a maid, like a housekeeper, like makes some noise behind them. They all just like blast her immediately and like blow up her cart, and like all the walls get ripped up and everything. She's on the floor and she's like, what are you doing? And it's the response is super quiet. They all just, sorry, ma'am. Sorry. And then they just let it breathe for a while. And so you can just sit with this, like, look, they just destroyed this thing for no reason. And it's funny and it works and it doesn't step on itself. And I think this movie at least did a pretty good job of that. Like, I think Ghostbusters Afterlife doesn't fill up screen time with just jabber, in the way that the 2016 version did. But let's wrap this up and then get into a bonus section, because I think there's some good stuff to talk about. What are your sort of final thoughts on this movie?
This movie is definitely worth watching. Especially if you're a fan of the original Ghostbusters. This is not the train wreck that the 2016 reboot was. This feels more like a natural continuation of the first two movies, just, like 30 years later. And it largely works.